Hello and welcome to Independence Live. I'm Ian Bruce in Glasgow and this is Rising Clyde, the programme where we'll be looking at the key issues and the big challenges facing the struggle for climate justice here in Scotland and around the world. In this second episode, we want to dig into the new situation thrown up by the cost of living crisis and the war in Ukraine, its implications for climate change and for climate justice here in Scotland. And in particular, we want to try to understand the new challenges facing the struggle to phase out North Sea oil and gas. To help us understand that, we're very happy to have with us Maggie Chapman. She is Scottish Green Party MSP for the North East region, and Ryan Morrison, Just Transition campaigner for Friends of the Earth Scotland. Thank you so much to both of you for being with us. Before we jump into the discussion, let's just take a quick look at this short video.
Pickets, the workers unite with our brothers and our sisters in many far off lands. There is power in the union.
As climate activists turning up for workers in the same way that they turned up for us during COP26 and that the trade unions turned up for us is so important to prove that link, because the same thing that sacked P&O, the same fundamental economics of the free market, the same thing that's pouring petrol on our planet, they share a root cause and we share a fight.
From the cities and the farmlands to trenches full of mud, war has always been the boss's way, sir.
We're here protesting at the site of CPeak's offices in Glasgow. CPeak are one of the biggest gas shipping firms in the world. Most of the oil that we do dig out in the North Sea gets sent abroad anyway, and then we import from places like Russia or Saudi Arabia or other corrupt states guilty of human rights abuses. So we're calling for accelerated production of domestic renewables for both the sake of the climate crisis, cost of living crisis, and to disrupt this war.
The other day we had the announcement that unfortunately Shell is actively reconsidering going ahead with Cambo. In the next 2 to 3 months, the UK government wants to approve a new gas field which is also owned by Shell, called the Jackdaw gas field. But despite the current political context we find ourselves in, and despite how hard it is to get out of bed every day knowing what we know, as people who understand the reality and untold suffering of the climate crisis, despite how hard that is, we need to hold each other and lift each other up, because backing down is not an option, and letting these projects go ahead is not an option.
Solidarity forever! Solidarity forever! Solidarity forever! For the union makes us strong! Thanks very much, everybody!
So we saw there 3 moments which I think illustrate some of the aspects of this new situation. Climate activists with trade unions showing solidarity for the workers sacked by P&O. Then we saw Glasgow calls out polluters blockading the Glasgow offices of a major gas shipping company, CPeak, in solidarity with Ukraine. And lastly, the Fridays for Future global climate strike focusing on the future of the North Sea. So let's jump straight in with you, Ryan. I wonder, do you think UK government policy on extracting gas from the North Sea has changed or is changing as a result of this new situation, the rise in prices or the war in Ukraine? I mean, we still haven't seen that new energy policy, which I think has been delayed, 3 or 4 times in the last few weeks. So, what is going on? What can we expect?
Yeah, I think we've seen a shift in tone in some of the narrative maybe on the policy around oil and gas, but what we haven't seen is any shift in the actual position around what will happen to the future of North Sea oil and gas production. So the policy position of maximising economic recovery remains the priority. That remained the priority last year. That's still the government's position. Even in this situation, what we hear quite often is we want to grow renewables, we want to grow our domestic renewable capacity, but they also say they want to back North Sea oil and gas production. Whatever that means, it's not clear. But what we do know is that last year, when the pressure of COP was on, they were challenged on oil and gas production policy. They said they would create a climate compatibility checkpoint, which looks to us, it very much seems to be a way to try and greenwash future licensing rounds, even though we know they are inconsistent with climate limits. So maximising economic recovery remains, but at the same time, there's a lot more pressure for a rapid rise in renewable capacity from the UK government, for sure.
But what about this threat? Do we expect a very short-term fast tracking of some of those new fields?
I think so. There is pressure from industry. I think there's a lot of calls from industry for that. I think we've seen the trade body, Oil and Gas UK, now calling itself Offshore Energies UK, have been, I would suggest, trying to take advantage of the current situation in order to justify future licensing round and greenlighting of fields that are currently waiting for approval. It's a particularly dangerous way forward. I think it's also quite disingenuous. Of the 30 fields that are currently waiting for approvals or consent, so these are fields that already have licenses, 75% of those reserves are oil, not gas. So they offer no solution to that current problem. They also offer no solution to the current problem because they will still take potentially 10 years to get into operation, by which point they're not able to help in the situation that we're in.
Right. Maggie, I want to get onto the Scottish government's position in just a moment, but in terms of, you represent the northeastern region. What are people? Is there a change in the mood there? Are people's expectations different? I mean, how do you think it's impacting in that sense?
I think the last year in Scottish politics has seen a shift. As a Green, being elected in the northeast was significant last May, and I think having spoken to oil and gas workers, having spoken to people in or associated with the oil and gas industry, I think there is recognition that is the energy industry of the past. It is an industry in decline, and what is really, really important is that we within Scotland do whatever it is that is necessary to enable the transition away from oil and gas to be a genuinely just one. Now, there's lots of discussion about what a just transition actually means, but I think for me there are a couple of crucial elements. There has to be a very, very clear collaboration with and co-creation of the future with oil and gas workers and with the communities that are going to be most affected by by the energy shifts that we know we need to see. And I think that engagement with oil and gas workers, that engagement with communities, that has to be central to our transition planning. Alongside that, we need to make sure that vested interests, Ryan there talked about what was Oil and Gas UK, offshore energies, that they have significant interests in our energy future. And I think we need to make sure that actually they aren't the ones driving the change, that it's the workers and the communities that are driving the change we need to see. More broadly, I think over the last few weeks, we've seen repeated attempts by the Scottish Conservatives to put pressure on Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government and the Greens to roll back on our commitments around just transition, but also to say, actually, we need to look again at Cambo, we need to look again at oil and gas fields in the North Sea. That's exactly the wrong thing to be doing. Our position remains the same. We need to be investing in the energies of the future now, and any money that is spent, that is invested in the fossil fuel industry now, is money not going into our renewables future, and that's where the balance is really, really important. We need to make sure that we shift that in favor of renewables, because we know that that's not only going to be where we get cheaper energy supplies. Renewable electricity is the cheapest form of electricity at the moment, so it deals with the cost of living crisis. It also means that we aren't beholden to Russian gas, so it removes our reliance on oppressive regimes like Putin's Russia, and it also then obviously helps us tackle the climate emergency.
I mean, I want to come back to the issue of a just transition, because obviously that's crucial, but just in terms of Scottish government policy on the extraction of oil and gas itself, I mean, when Nicola Sturgeon came out against Cambo just days after the end of COP, that seemed like a significant moment, and it felt as if that had a real impact on Shell's at least initial decision to pull out. Now they kind of seem to be, umming and ahhing a little bit. But So in other words, Scottish Government position appeared to change, and seemed to have that change seemed to have an important impact. Will that change hold? Because one thing is your position in the Green Party, and the position of the SNP, of course, is somewhat different. You know, at least there are nuances of difference, right? Will they hold to that? Because before they had this position of, well, it's not really our responsibility, and but maybe not, kind of thing. So will they hold to at least verbally opposing new oil and gas fields?
I mean, that's certainly what we've seen in the last couple of weeks when both the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Matheson, and Nicola Sturgeon have been questioned on this in the chamber. They have both held firm. They've held that position. It's certainly the discussions that we continue to have with the Scottish Government on a regular basis. It's very, very clear that we are expecting them to hold that position. And whilst we do have, as you say, I think we have a difference in nuance, a difference in maybe speed in between the parties of how we want the just transition to go, and we also, I think, have a fundamental difference about any future of fossil fuels as not an energy industry, as other forms of industry. I think there has to be a very, very clear position from the government and from the Scottish Government, and I don't see that changing. I think it's become clear that the future for Scotland, the future for Scotland's energy system, is in renewables, and we need to make sure we get on with the job of making that the reality.
Ryan, is there more that you think the Scottish Government could or should be doing?
I mean, it has been very useful to see Nicola Sturgeon and Michael Matheson both defending that position and justifying why in the face of some of what the Conservative pressure has been. I think particularly recently, when these calls for Campbell to be licensed as a response to what's going on now, which is obviously so disingenuous as a new license for a field that could take years, was very valuable. It's really important to see the First Minister laying out why exactly that is not a reasonable answer to this and what the real solutions are. In terms of the other Scottish Government policy, we're expecting an energy strategy this year with some just transition plans, and there is quite a lot that we would hope to see change. And I think beyond
Sorry,
that,
do you mean a Scottish Government,
Scottish
Government energy policy?
Yeah. Yeah, so the Scottish Government is committed to doing a new energy strategy. The last one was in 2017. Even though policy around oil and gas is largely reserved, offshore oil and gas is reserved, that last energy strategy included the Scottish Government's absolute commitment to maximising economic recovery as well. So they were saying they would do everything that they could as a devolved administration to support that industry. So obviously we would expect now in this context to see something very different. But I think what we'll also be looking for is what are some of the other industry proposals that are attempting to undermine what is actually needed in energy transition. And I'm looking particularly at things like fossil hydrogen, which relies on huge amounts of natural gas and is incredibly energy intensive and inefficient, and also things like carbon capture and storage. Are we going to see an energy strategy that commits us to essentially new infrastructure for the fossil fuel industry? And that will be some of the key, I think, deciding factors about whether or not this is going to be an energy strategy that takes the Scottish Government on a sidestep of planning a really serious transition away from fossil fuels, as opposed to planning for a transition without future licensing potentially, but still relying on fossil fuels in the economy for energy.
Maggie, let me try and, since Ryan's brought up this issue of a new Scottish Government energy policy, let me try and link that to something else I wanted to ask you about, which is this whole narrative of net zero, which, the Scottish government, the SNP rather, leadership appears to still espouse and use as part of its arguments. And of course, one of the main arguments put forward by the climate justice movement around the COP26 coalition and all its various different components was precisely, net zero is not zero, and therefore, all the offsets and so forth that go along with it, are, false solutions and so forth, the kind of thing Ryan was just talking about. So, can we expect? I mean, two things. What are the key issues that you, as the Green Party, want to see included and/or changed in this new Scottish Government energy policy? And could we see some kind of a break with that net zero narrative?
Gosh, okay. I'll take them in reverse order. The net zero narrative, I think, is so well ingrained in Scottish, UK, and global discussions, but both policy and sort of strategic thinking in this. I think it's problematic because we know that, as you said, it's not zero carbon. We aren't looking at a zero carbon strategy with the way things are going, and that is a problem. That's a problem for a whole range of reasons. And the recent discussions around, keeping 1.5 degrees alive, keeping that hope. I think one of the really important things for us to keep reiterating is 1.5 degrees global temperature rises still signifies destruction and death for many habitats, many ecosystems, many people in different parts of the world. So 1.5 is not a success. It is the least worst option here. So I think as Greens, we've probably got some work still to do within the Scottish Government and within discussions across Scottish politics to, yes, okay, do we have to live with the net zero language at the moment? But really, actually, what we are looking for is a zero carbon future, a future that does not continue to pump carbon dioxide and other climate changing emissions into our atmosphere. I think the question.
Just let me press you a little bit,
Yeah.
a little further, because I'm sure you're not going to tell me about secret, obviously, detailed negotiations that the Greens are having with the SNP, because you obviously can't. But what I'm assuming you are in discussions over this new energy policy. So I'm just wondering what, from the Green Party point of view, the SGP point of view, is what are the key points you want to insist on, and think you can insist on?
I mean, I suppose. So firstly, to say I'm not the party's energy spokesperson. So I'm not involved in the nitty gritty of that on a weekly basis. That goes to Mark Ruskell, my colleague. But I suppose there are key issues. Ryan, talked about carbon capture, utilization and storage, and hydrogen. Our position, as set out in the Butte House Agreement that we signed with the Scottish Government last year, it's very, very clear that we have a different position. The Scottish Greens have a different position on CCUS and hydrogen to the Scottish Government. I think we would probably be wanting to firm up some of the commitments around that and actually have a very, very clear outline and plan of what, if any, future those industries are going to play, given, as Ryan rightly says, that the reliance on a long-term future for oil and gas that they will have. I think that there are a couple of other things, and it goes back to what I was talking about earlier around the just transition. There's no point in having an energy strategy that talks about net zero or even zero carbon, for that matter, that doesn't have a very, very clear commitment to the kind of alternative industries that we are going to need to see investment in, the kind of approach and the value that the voices of the oil and gas workers and the communities most directly affected by this transition, how they will be heard, how they will not only be heard and listened to, but actually how they will be incorporated into the planning and the development of our future energy systems. So those I think are two of the key areas that we'll be looking for very, very strong commitments from the Scottish Government on. I think there are other issues as well, and this is where the differences between what is reserved and what are devolved powers comes into it. I think we need to be much better at seeing the connections between energy, which is reserved, and things that are very, very clearly devolved, like local planning, like a certain ownership of land, of resources, of rights, those kinds of things. And I'm not always sure we get the joining up of these different issues as effectively as we could. So I think that's another area. It's around policy coherence, but I think more importantly, it's not seeing energy as a thing in isolation. but it's seeing it alongside, if we're looking at our future energy needs, what are we saying about our building standards? What are we saying about our transport networks? What are we saying about our rail networks? All of these kinds of things have to be part of that discussion, and they have to be at least referenced in the new energy strategy. Because if our strategy only talks to a very, very narrow understanding of and definition of the energy industry, then well, we've missed a trick. The climate emergency notwithstanding, I think we have to have that broader view and broader thinking in that strategy.
I mean, is it possible to argue for a just transition that does guarantee no job losses for North Sea oil workers and, appropriate training? I think one of their complaints at the moment, I understand, is that they're not being given. Often they have to pay for their own training if they want to shift sectors or shift jobs, that kind of thing. That it's not just, shouldn't be seen as a one for one, like come off an oil rig and go onto a wind farm kind of thing, but that there are many other things that North Sea oil workers and related industry people could be doing in a new vision of an economy, precisely all the areas you just mentioned: homes, transport, care, etc. That kind of an integral vision. Is that, are we getting towards that?
I think I have to say yes, we are, because if we're not, then where is our hope? But I think what one, it's challenging. It is challenging, and I think purely from an economic point of view, it's hugely challenging. As you say, making sure we've got the education systems and structures right, that we have the skills training in the places where they need to be. That's a hugely big, it's a huge ask, but it's a really, really important one. I think if we think what happened on the 1st of April with energy, home energy prices skyrocketing, people really, really going to be feeling a very, very tight squeeze on their home finances. One of the things that we've been talking about is how do we get the massive retrofit of everybody's homes? How do we roll that out? How do we scale that up in a quick and effective way for people? It's not good enough to say, okay, now we'll have this all done by 2032. We need it done now, and I think we don't necessarily have the right number of people with the skills to do that. Never mind the materials that we need to deliver that, the supply chains that we need to deliver that. So there are a whole range of things that we are needing to get in place, and get in place very, very quickly. Are we going to get it all right? No, of course we're not. But I think we need to make sure that we are as focused on this as we possibly can be, because it is that is the only way that we not only see the transition away from oil and gas and the support for the workers that you mentioned there, Ian, but significantly actually the effects for people, the positive effects on their energy bills, the positive effects on people's standards of living in warmer, drier, safer, more secure homes. And we know this is possible, that that the retrofit and work that was done in Glasgow. I'm in Aberdeen. There are tower blocks in Aberdeen that are horrendously drafty, horrendously damp and cold. We need the Scottish Government working with Aberdeen City Council and others to make sure that we get the same kind of retrofitting, cladding, insulation, heat pumps, all of those things into these residences as fast as possible, because that'll have a material impact, a positive material impact on people's home finances, and it'll also help us drive that change away from oil and gas.
We've only got a couple more minutes left, so I just want to try and bring this back to where we started, in a sense, the current situation as a result of the war in Ukraine and the rising gas prices. I mean, Ryan, you pointed out, and it's something I've heard pointed out often, and it seems blindingly obvious, really, that the arguments for digging more out of the North Sea are fairly ridiculous, in as much as they're obviously not going to do anything to resolve the immediate problems. in terms of gas prices and so forth, because we're talking about long-term things, and so that's a very strong argument, clearly. But doesn't that same argument actually apply to our own solutions? That's to say, okay, so obviously the answer is renewables, but that also takes quite a long time, or a certain amount of time. It's not going to solve the problem in the next few weeks or months or year, So what do we do in the short term? What are the short-term policies we need?
I think the sort of average time span for even an onshore wind farm could be between 6 and 10 years, maybe. But I guess what's important to say is that particularly the short term is about dealing with what is going to be absolutely extremely devastating social consequences of these price rises to millions of people into fuel poverty. The solutions have to be supporting people paying their bills and making sure that people are not left in poverty by what happens now. Everything else is then building towards a different energy system. There are things that we could start doing quicker. So Maggie mentioned we could start a wide nationwide retrofit program. We could insulate people's homes, we could electrify energy heating systems. That's something that could start much quicker than any new generation of renewables.
How quick? I mean, so it's just because people probably don't have, how long would it be realistic to say have, I don't know, a third of Scottish homes retrofitted? How long does that take?
I couldn't put an exact year on that. Very difficult. But I mean, you can look at some of the things that are going on now, and obviously there are challenges. So I think Maggie mentioned the tenement project that happened around the corner from me in the south side of Glasgow. That took quite a long time. Tenements are a particular challenge, but it would be possible to roll it out in other areas far quicker. And we're seeing good examples of electrification of heat happening. For instance, project in Glasgow using water, heat from the water in the Clyde. Example in Gateshead recently of a house being connected up to ground source heat pump using water from an abandoned coal mine, which has meant that person had not had a price rise for their bills recently using the reservoirs that were there. So those, I can't say precisely how many years it would take to get a third of houses in Scotland up, but that is something that you could start doing quicker than new renewable generations would be even. But at the same time, we do have to have our eye on not just building out of this crisis, out of this energy system, but also about climate change and the climate crisis and what we need for the future. So there is a real issue about making sure that our energy systems are secure and resilient, and we can't build out of this crisis by building further into another one. It's really important that we start to look at what some of the fundamental flaws are here, and they are bigger than just issues of pollution or even just issues of the current gas price crisis. People are profiting from the absolute devastation being caused in people's lives now as prices go up, but they are also profiting from what is going on with climate change. That's a real issue. We are dealing with incredibly powerful vested interests who quite often have the ear of government very handily. And that's an issue that we need to face when we look to move on from this. What are we building away from? Why is it that it's possible for this to happen? That's an issue of where we get our energy from, but it's also an issue of who's in charge of it, who has their hands in control.
Yeah. So we're going to have to close up right now, but Maggie, did you want to come back on that very briefly?
I suppose just the only thing to say is we need to be working as hard as we can to get onshore renewables back in our systems in Scotland. You know, we know that onshore wind farms can take 10, 15 years to get into place. The vast majority of that comes down to planning. So if there are ways that we can, you know, not necessarily short circuit or make them less effective planning processes, but if there are ways that we can look at some of the other systems and the other restrictions or other limiting areas that have made some of the onshore wind farms take so long, then that's something that we should be doing. And I appreciate that is something that is reserved, the support for onshore wind. But if that's something that we can extract from the UK government in its new energy strategy, I think that will be significant. It's about, again, it comes back to look at, as I said before, looking at where these things intersect. You know, we need to make sure our planning system is ready to go. We need to make sure our education and skills systems are ready to go. We need to make sure that we've got the supply chains in place. It's not just a matter of turning off oil and gas and turning on wind or tidal or wave or anything like that. It's the systems around that. And there's an awful lot of work we've still got to do. Absolutely.
And there's a lot more that we need to talk about too. There's at least two upcoming programs you've just mentioned there, which we need to talk about renewables specifically, and we need to talk about land and how it's who controls it and who plans it and all the rest of it. Yeah, but thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Really nice to have that discussion with you, and I hope it's sparked some thoughts amongst our viewers. Thank you very much indeed to both of you, and we'll be back next month. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.